My family mocked my dead-end job at Thanksgiving. My manager was at the table. There's a version of you that other people keep. Not the current version, not the one who wakes up in the morning and makes decisions and knows, with the particular clarity of someone who has done the work, exactly what she's built. The version they keep is older, smaller, fixed at whatever age you were the last time they were paying close attention. For some people, that version is kind, generous even, the best they ever were, preserved in someone else's memory like a photograph from a good year. For other people, it's something different. Not cruel, just incomplete. A sketch that stopped before the detail was added. I had a version of myself in my family's keeping that had been incomplete for a long time. They knew I worked in operations. They knew I was at a company called Harrison Group, that it had something to do with supply chains and distribution and the movement of goods from one place to another. They knew I had a steady paycheck and a car that started reliably, and that I did not, as far as they could tell, seem unhappy. They had decided, somewhere in the years when I stopped explaining, that this was the full picture. The Thanksgiving I want to tell you about is the one where someone outside my family looked at that picture and said quietly, without drama, that it was missing quite a lot. My name is Claire Whitmore, and this is the night the picture changed. Hi, I'm Martin. Sit with me for a bit. Tonight we're spending time with Claire, 38, operations executive, the one in her family who was always introduced with a slight pause before the job title. She brought 3 people to Thanksgiving that year, one of whom her family had never met. What happened at that table wasn't planned, wasn't a performance, and wasn't something anyone walked in intending. But it was a long time coming. Subscribe if you haven't. We're here every day. Let's go. The invitation arrived the first week of November, as it always did. My mother hand-wrote them every year on cream-colored cards she kept in a kitchen drawer next to the calendar, and a spare pen she'd had since Reagan. I received mine on a Thursday, forwarded from my old address to my current one, even though she'd had both for years. Some habits in my family were not about practicality. They were about pattern. I stood at my kitchen counter and turned the card over twice. Thanksgiving dinner, Millbrook, 2 in the afternoon, her house. The same as it had been for 26 years. The same cream-colored tablecloth with small brown leaves that she bought the year Derek started high school. The same seating arrangement. My father at the head, my mother at the other end, Derek to my father's left, me to my father's right, and whoever was brought that year filling in the gaps of the lawn table. That year I had 3 extra chairs to fill. I had told my mother in October that I'd be bringing colleagues. 2 people who didn't have anywhere to go for the holiday. James, who was from Cincinnati and couldn't get back easily, and Maya, who was newer to the team and had mentioned in a meeting too casually that she didn't have family in the city. And Richard. My mother had asked if Richard was a friend, and I had said yes, because the alternative required a conversation I didn't have the bandwidth for at that particular moment, which was standing in the parking garage of the Harrison Group regional office at 7:30 on a Tuesday evening, keys in hand, 12 hours into a day that was supposed to end at 5. She had said fine. I had said thank you. That was that. Richard Chen was my colleague at Harrison. That is the word I used with my mother, and it was accurate, and it was also insufficient in the way that technically correct words sometimes are. He was 52, originally from Portland, had 2 grown kids who lived in Seattle, and a dog named Frank who was photographed on his desk in a frame that tilted slightly to the left. For 3 years, he had been my direct supervisor, vice president of regional operations for the Mid-Atlantic and Southeast divisions. overseeing roughly 1,100 employees across 4 states. We had worked together through 2 restructurings, a significant client acquisition, and a contract dispute that had taken 8 months to resolve, and that I still thought about with the particular affection of a difficult thing survived. 8 months before this Thanksgiving, I had been promoted to his level. We were, as of March, peers. I had the North and Mid-Atlantic Territory. He had the South. We reported to the same executive. We sat next to each other in quarterly sessions. We were, if you needed a word that was both precise and complete, equals. I had not told my family. Not because I was hiding it. More because the news, when I had tried it briefly with my mother, "I've been promoted, Linda, to regional VP," and received a response that was both warm and entirely uncomprehending. "Oh, that's wonderful, honey. Will it be more hours?" After that, I had simply let it sit. There was only so much energy I had for translating a world they didn't speak into a language they'd accept. Richard had mentioned the week before Thanksgiving that he had no plans for the holiday. His ex-wife had the kids this year. His closest friends in the city had gone to California. He was considering ordering Thai food and watching a documentary about the Golden Gate Bridge. I had said, before I thought it through, "Come to my parents' house for dinner." He had looked at me with the careful expression of someone calculating whether an offer is genuine. "Your family Thanksgiving." "There's always more food than people," I said, "and it would be better than eating alone." He had accepted, and I had immediately understood that I had not thought this fully through, not because Richard was a problem, but because I had just introduced a new variable into a system I had been carefully managing for years, and new variables have consequences. I had driven home that evening thinking about what exactly I had done. Richard Chen was not just any colleague. He was someone who knew, in precise and well-documented detail, exactly what I did and what it was worth. He had signed off on my promotion paperwork. He had read the restructuring reports and the quarterly reviews and the performance metrics for every member of my team. He understood the actual shape of my work in the way that only someone who does the same work at the same level can. And I had just invited that person to Thanksgiving, into a room where my family would spend the afternoon treating my career as a minor footnote. I could not decide, in the days that followed, whether this was a mistake or the first honest thing I'd done in years. The week before the dinner, Derek called. He called on a Tuesday evening while I was in my car in the parking structure under my building, which seemed to be the place where I had all my most manageable conversations. "Mom said you're bringing people," he said. "Work people." "A couple of colleagues," I said. "And my boss." A pause. "Your boss?" "Yes." "The warehouse guy." I took a breath that I did not let become audible. "Richard is the VP of Regional Operations," I said. "He oversees—" Right. "The logistics thing." He said it the way people say the vegan thing or the therapy thing, acknowledging without engaging. "Should be interesting." He hung up before I finished deciding whether interesting was friendly or hostile. I sat in the car for a moment, engine ticking, and stared at the parking structure wall. I had, over the previous 2 weeks, composed and not sent some version of a cancellation 4 separate times. The most recent draft, still sitting in my phone, read, "I'm so sorry. Something unexpected came up with the Seattle accounts. I'll send a dish and call on Friday." Plausible. Clean. No one would push back. I closed the draft. I don't entirely know why I went. That's the honest answer. There's a long version involving fatigue and stubbornness and the specific loneliness of not being known by people who were supposed to know you. And there's a shorter version, which is just, I wanted them to see. Not to perform anything, not to engineer a moment. I simply wanted, for once, for the room to have the right picture. Whether that was a good reason is something I still haven't decided. The next morning, I texted James, "Are you still coming Thursday?" He wrote back, "Yes." "Do I need to prepare for anything?" I wrote, "Just be yourself." He sent back a single period, which meant, "Understood. I know this situation. I'll be ready." I texted Maya, "Thanksgiving is on. Dress comfortably, not formally." She wrote, "What should I know before we get there?" I thought about that for a while. Then I wrote, "My brother is a corporate attorney. He's never been mean exactly. Just be ready for a certain kind of confidence." She wrote back a thumbs up. She was 29 and had come to us from a consulting firm in Boston and had the particular observational precision of someone who had grown up needing to read rooms quickly and accurately. I trusted her more than she probably knew. Thursday morning, I picked up Richard at his hotel at 11:30, then swung by to get James and Maya from the neighborhood where they both lived, 15 minutes apart. We were on the highway by 12:15. The day was clear and cold, the kind of November day that looks warmer from the inside than it is. Richard sat in the passenger seat and asked about my family with the calm curiosity of someone who had no stakes in the answers. He asked how many siblings I had, whether my parents had always been in Millbrook, what my father had done. I answered everything. It felt, in a strange way, like a briefing, the kind we did before client meetings, where you laid out the room before you walked into it. I did not brief him on the relevant history. I'm not certain I could have said why in that moment. Perhaps because a briefing would have made the day feel like a strategy session, and some part of me was still hoping, despite all evidence, that it wouldn't need to be one. Let me tell you what I actually do for a living, because the details matter here. Harrison Group manages supply chain and operational infrastructure for manufacturing and retail clients across the Eastern Seaboard. What that means in practice is that we figure out how products move, from production facilities to distribution centers to retail locations to end consumers. And we figure out how to do that without unnecessary time, cost, or error. It is not glamorous work in the way that law is glamorous, or finance, or medicine. There are no dramatic moments in a courtroom. There are no closing bells. There are systems, and there are the places those systems break, and there is the particular satisfaction, genuine, persistent, deeply mine, of finding the one change that fixes 6 problems at once. I had been at Harrison for 9 years. In that time, I had risen from a mid-level analyst role to director of operations to 8 months before this Thanksgiving, regional vice president. My territory covered approximately 1,500 employees across 6 states. I had a budget that ran into 8 figures annually. I had driven 2 major operational restructurings, the second of which had been covered in a trade publication as a case study in efficiency gains. And I had a team of 14 people who reported directly to me and who were, without exception, better at their specific roles than I would have been. I did not say any of this to my family. Not out of modesty. Out of a decision I had made slowly over several years after trying the alternative. The alternative had not gone well. I am going to tell you about a dinner. It was the summer Derek graduated from law school. I was 24, he was 29, and our family gathered at my parents' house for a celebration that was clearly his, but that included everyone. The way family celebrations always technically include everyone, while actually being about one person. I was newly employed at a mid-sized distribution company, having turned down a law school acceptance that I had received and told no one about. I had decided I didn't want law. I wanted operations. I understood, even then, that this was not the choice my family would have chosen for me, and I had processed that understanding mostly alone. Derek that summer was confident in the way of someone who has been moving toward a destination for years and has finally arrived. He made everyone laugh. He poured wine for the whole table without being asked. He was, genuinely, at his best, and his best was good. Whatever I can say about my brother, I want to be honest. He was charming, he was smart, and in his good moments, he had a warmth that felt real. That summer was one of his good moments. At some point in the evening, my father looked at both of us and said, "I'm proud of you both. I really am." And then he turned to Derek and said, "Tell me again about the practice area. Corporate transactional, what does that actually involve day to day?" Derek talked about it for about 10 minutes. It was interesting, actually, the details of how deals were structured, how negotiations worked, the way a transaction moved from term sheet to closing. My father listened with the focused attention he usually reserved for engineering problems, which was the highest form of engagement he had. At the end of it, he said, looking at Derek with something I can only describe as pride that didn't require translating, "That's real work." And then my mother said that she'd been thinking about repainting the dining room and whether eggshell or cream would be better. And the conversation moved on. I drove home that night with the radio off. I sat with the specific weight of having been in the room and not been in the room at the same time, and I did not cry, which surprises me now when I think about it. Because looking back, the feeling was large enough for tears. But I was 24 and had not yet fully understood that this was going to be a pattern and not an incident. That's real work. I'd have thought about those 3 words many times over 15 years. They lodged somewhere I couldn't quite reach, and everything I built afterward was built in their presence, which I have not always been sure is a good thing. About 2 years after that dinner, Derek had a firm event, a client cocktail party at a restaurant in the city that spouses and family were invited to. I went because my mother asked me to, and because I thought it would be fine, which was optimistic in retrospect. Derek was in his element. He moved through the room the way he moved through all rooms that were organized around his expertise, easily, confidently, stopping at the right moments. At one point, he introduced me to a client, a man in his 60s who had the particular ease of someone who has done very well for a long time. The introduction went, "This is my sister Claire. She's in, what are you calling it now? Logistics?" He smiled at me as if expecting confirmation. The client nodded and said, "Great industry logistics. Very nuts and bolts." And then he asked Derek about the Mets, and that was that. I stood with my drink and thought very clearly that I would not attend another Sturm event. I never did. The thing I want to be careful about is not making Derek into a cartoon. He was a person who had decided, early and without much examination, that what he did was the kind of work that mattered, and who had extended that framework to the people around him without ever really questioning it. He loved me in the specific way of a brother who has known you your whole life and still fundamentally does not know you. Those 2 things were both true at once, and they made for a complicated kind of relationship, warm on the surface, cold in the details. The pattern established itself slowly, the way patterns do, not through any single dramatic decision, but through the accumulation of small ones. I would share news, receive a response that was kind but not engaged, and calibrate my expectations downward. The adjustments were almost invisible. One year, I stopped mentioning promotions, because the response was always about whether it meant more hours. The next year, I stopped bringing up specific projects because explaining the context required more patience than I had after long days. The year after that, I stopped expecting anything at all and found that the absence of expectation was, paradoxically, easier than the ongoing disappointment. There was the Easter when my mother said, after I had tried to describe a client integration I'd led, "Well, at least it's steady. You know, with Derek in a big firm, you never know what they'll do to the associates." She meant it as comfort. I understood that. I also went home that evening and sat in my kitchen for a long time. There was a Christmas when I mentioned carefully a deal I had led that had been significant. The numbers were real, the outcome had been covered in our industry, and Derek had listened and said, "That's great, Claire, but you're not running the company, right? Like you're still operations, not strategy." He was locating it on the map he had, and on his map, operations was a floor below strategy, which was a floor below law, which was the top. He wasn't wrong about the hierarchy he'd internalized. He was just wrong about the map. There was the year I received an award at Harrison's National Conference, an operations leadership recognition that the company gave to one regional director annually, and I had sent my family the date 4 weeks in advance. My mother had said she'd try to come. On the day itself, she sent a text at 11 in the morning, "Hope it goes beautifully. You deserve it." My father sent nothing, which was normal for him and not unkind. Derek sent a thumbs up emoji 2 days later. I had the award on my bookshelf at home. I had also, in the moment of standing at the podium and scanning the room, noticed the empty seats in the section where family members were seated and filed that information away in the place where I kept information that was too heavy to carry in the front of my mind. And there was the press release. This was 2 years before this Thanksgiving. The restructuring I had led, the second one, the larger one, had been written up by our communications team and put out through our press channels as a case study. It mentioned Harrison Group, mentioned the operational metrics, and mentioned me by name and title. I had sent my mother the link with a short note. "This is about the project I led last year." They wrote it up. She had responded, "That's very professional, honey. You look nice in the photo." I had looked at that message for a long time before writing back. "Thank you," I had written. That was when I understood that explanation was not going to be the answer. You cannot explain your way into being seen by people who have already decided what you are. The picture they hold is not updated by information. It's updated, if at all, by something else. Something that confronts rather than informs. I want to tell you for a moment what the work actually was, because I think it helps to know. When I took over the North and Mid-Atlantic territory in March, I inherited a division that had been running on processes that were 10 years old and a client portfolio that hadn't been structurally reviewed in 4. Within the first 60 days, I had identified 6 contracts that were underperforming against the terms we'd agreed to. 3 regional facilities that were operating at inefficiencies that cost us collectively about $200,000 a quarter, and 1 compliance issue in a New Jersey warehouse that, if it had been flagged by an auditor before I found it, would have been a significant problem for the company's regulatory standing. I fixed all of it. Not quickly, carefully. The way you fix a system that has been running wrong for long enough that the wrong has become the baseline and people have stopped seeing it. By the time this Thanksgiving arrived, my division had closed its best Q3 in 6 years. I had 3 performance reviews pending for team members I was recommending for promotion. I had a site visit in January that I was looking forward to, which was not something I could have said 6 months earlier when the region had felt like a patient that hadn't been properly diagnosed yet. I knew the work was real. I had never doubted that part. What I had doubted, over the years, in the quiet of various parking structures and empty offices and long drives home, was whether it would ever matter to the people who were supposed to matter to me. I had not planned to confront anything. That much I want to be clear about. But I had also, by that point, run out of other approaches. The week before Thanksgiving was one of the harder weeks of that quarter. I had a team review on Monday that required a 3-hour prep on Sunday night. Tuesday was a full day of Q4 planning sessions, the ones Richard was in town for, that ran until 7:30, at which point I went directly to a client call that lasted until 9. Wednesday I was in New Jersey by 7 a.m. for a site review, back in the city by 2, on a Seattle call until 5:30, and then packing a bag while eating leftover soup standing at my kitchen counter. I was tired, in the specific way of a week that doesn't leave room for anything that isn't the next immediate task. The holiday sitting on the other side of it felt honestly like another logistical problem to solve. At 10 o'clock Wednesday night, I opened my phone and read the unsent draft again. I'm so sorry. Something unexpected came up. I read it twice. I put the phone face down on the bed. I finished packing. I set my alarm. I want to be honest about what I was feeling, because I think it matters for understanding the rest of this story. I was not feeling brave. I was not feeling strategic. I was feeling the particular exhaustion of someone who has managed their own invisibility for long enough that they've forgotten what the alternative would look like. And underneath that exhaustion was something simpler and less dignified. I wanted to stop being invisible. Not to be celebrated, just to be seen, accurately, by the people who were supposed to know me. It was not a sophisticated motivation, but it was the real one. The morning of Thanksgiving, James texted at 8 a.m., "You okay?" I wrote back, "Yes." "Are you ready?" He wrote, "I've been ready for this for 4 years." I almost laughed. James Okafor had been with me at Harrison long enough to know the rough shape of my family situation. Not the details, but the general topology of it, the geography of who was seen and who wasn't. He had never said anything direct about it, but he also had a way of being present in moments that required it, which was its own form of loyalty. He had once, about 2 years into working together, asked me why I never talked about family the way other people on the team did, casually, in passing, the way people mention the context of their lives. I had thought about how to answer for a moment, and then said simply, "It's complicated." He had nodded and said, "Okay," and never pushed, and I had respected him for it enormously. The people who don't push when you say it's complicated are rare, and worth keeping close. At 11, I picked up Richard from his hotel. He was already outside when I pulled up, which was characteristic. He was wearing a dark navy sweater and carrying the 2 bottles of wine he'd clearly thought about. "Ready?" he said, getting in. "More or less," I said. He nodded and put on his seatbelt and looked out the window as I pulled into traffic. And for a moment, neither of us said anything, and I found myself grateful for his particular quality of silence, which was never empty. We arrived at 12:45. 15 minutes early, which meant my mother was still arranging things in the kitchen, and my father was watching football in the living room with the focused calm of a man who has been told that the next hour will be social and has decided to get his quiet in while he can. Derek's car was already in the driveway. He was always early to things, a habit I had come to understand was less about punctuality and more about narrative. Whoever arrives first defines the room. My mother came to the door, wiping her hands on her apron. She was 67, and still moved through the kitchen the way she had when I was 12, with the specific efficiency of someone who has run a household long enough to know exactly where every step should be. She hugged me first, then turned to the room with the warm readiness she extended to all guests until she knew them well enough to be exasperated. "Richard," she said, extending her hand. "Claire has told us so much about you." She hadn't told him anything. This was simply the thing she said. "Very kind of you to have us," Richard said. He offered the wine without ceremony, and I watched my mother read the label in that fraction of a second way she had, and adjust her assessment upward by a barely perceptible degree. James and Maya introduced themselves. My mother said their names back to them the way she always did with new people, one more time than necessary, committing them. She directed us toward the living room. The house smelled of turkey and something with cinnamon, and the specific cedar and old paper smell that I associated with every significant family event of my life. Derek appeared from the living room with a timing that I had long since stopped reading as accidental. He was wearing a fleece, navy blue, his firm's name embroidered on the chest in white. He had been doing this for Thanksgiving for 5 years, and I had stopped commenting on it 3 years ago. His hair had more gray in it than when I'd last seen him in the spring. He looked comfortable in the way of someone who has settled into the life he planned and finds, for the most part, that it fits. "Claire," he said, with the warmth he reserved for family in social situations, genuine, but pitched slightly louder than it needed to be, and then to the room, and friends. He extended his hand to Richard. "Derek Whitmore, Claire's older brother. Corporate law, Harmon and Associates." "Richard Chen," Richard said. "I work with Claire." "Right, the logistics thing." He smiled, and I want to be clear, the smile was real. He was not performing hospitality. He was genuinely happy to have people in the house. This is what made the evening complicated rather than simple. Derek was not a villain in the way that word usually works. He was a man with a very specific kind of blindness, and he was wearing it openly, without any awareness that it was there. Good people in that industry. The supply chain doesn't run itself. Richard said nothing, which was a skill. He had the particular ability to receive a comment without returning it, and to make the silence so natural that the other person didn't notice. Derek's handshakes for James and Maya were warm and brief. He asked James what he did. James said, "Operations." Derek nodded in the way of someone filing information in a folder labeled "Similar to Claire." He asked Maya the same question. She said, "Strategic planning." He tilted his head with slightly more interest. Planning read as adjacent to strategy, which was adjacent to his register. We moved through the house. My father came in from the football game and shook hands with Richard and asked him where he was from, before returning to the couch with the economy of a man who has done his social duty and considers the rest optional. He had always been like this. It was not rudeness exactly, more a kind of honesty about the energy he had for people he didn't know yet, and a corresponding certainty that the people who mattered would come to know him in time. Patricia, Derek's wife, was in the kitchen helping with a casserole dish and some quiet disagreement about oven temperature. She came out to greet everyone and was careful in the way she always was, precise, appropriate, not unkind. Patricia had been Derek's wife for 11 years, and I had watched her, over those years, develop an increasingly refined economy of expression. She said what she meant and no more. I had a complicated respect for it. Derek's children came down briefly. Ellie, 9, with the confident curiosity of a youngest child. Max, 12, with the particular distraction of a kid who had been recently given a device and was counting the minutes until he could go back to it. They said hello to the room, and Ellie immediately fixed on Richard because he was new. "What do you do?" she asked him. She was standing at the edge of the adult circle with the directness of someone who has not yet learned that this question carries social weight. Richard looked at her with full attention. "I figure out how to move things from where they are to where they need to be," he said, "and how to do it without wasting time or money." She considered this. "That sounds like puzzles." "It is exactly like puzzles," he said. She seemed satisfied. She got a glass of juice and went upstairs. Richard looked back at his glass, and I saw, for just a moment, the very slight curve of something that wasn't quite a smile. The table was laid by two, and we sat down. The seating worked out as it always did. My father at the head, my mother across the table from him at the far end, Derek and Patricia to my father's left, me on the right. Richard ended up 2 seats away from me, next to James, which put him directly across from Patricia and diagonally from Derek. I noticed this and then stopped noticing it, because there was nothing I could have done about it, and because Ellie had materialized again beside me, asking if she could sit next to me for dinner, which she did, and which was unexpectedly steadying. My father said grace. 3 sentences, the same 3 every year. Something about gratitude, something about family, something about the year that was almost done. I had heard them so many times that they had become less a prayer than a signal, the formal beginning of a thing that had its own fixed shape. Turkey, cranberry sauce from the can, in the perfect ribbed cylinder that no one acknowledged. The green bean casserole that everyone ate, but no one complimented. 3 kinds of potato, bread. The table filled with the particular sound of family dinners, serving spoons against ceramic, chairs adjusting, the low hum of everyone settling into the shared fact of being together. Derek talked about a case that had settled in October. He was careful with details. He always was, which was professionally appropriate, and also a way of making the listener aware that there were details he was choosing not to share, which made the story feel larger than it might otherwise have. The shape of what he shared was clear enough. He had won something complicated. My father asked clarifying questions with genuine interest. My mother listened with the quality of attention she reserved for Derek's professional stories, which was focused and warm, and that I had spent years not resenting and occasionally failed at. James and Maya ate and offered appropriate responses when addressed. They were being careful. I could feel it across the table. The specific care of people who understand that they are guests in a dynamic they can observe but not fully map. Richard sat 2 chairs down from Derek and ate with the quiet attentiveness of a man who was hungry and whose food was good, and who was, I had come to understand over 3 years, an exceptionally careful listener. He had said perhaps 8 sentences since we arrived, none of them revealing. The conversation drifted. My mother asked Maya about Boston. James talked briefly about Cincinnati. Ellie described a project she was doing in school about the water cycle with an intensity that held the table for several minutes, because it was specific and genuine, and 9-year-olds, when they care about something, are often the most interesting people in any room. At some point, as the main course was being finished and the table relaxed into the slightly looser register of a meal that is mostly done, Derek looked across at me. "So, Claire," he said, with the ease of someone who considers this a neutral question, "how's the warehouse life treating you?" The words arrived the way they always did, not as a strike, which I could have prepared for, but as a casual observation, a passing reference to the fact of me as he had categorized it. Warehouse life. The way you might ask someone how life in the suburbs was treating them, or life in the arts. A category, not a person. It's good, I said. Same position? Same company? Same company, I said. Different position. They move you around? I was promoted, I said. Quite some time ago. Oh, nice. He reached for his wine. To what? Regional Vice President of Operations. There was a pause, brief, maybe 2 seconds, but measurable. My mother looked at me. My father was focused on his plate. Huh, Derek said. And then, in the voice of someone genuinely trying to locate information, in logistics, is that a significant title? Or is it more of a... It's significant, I said. I'm sure it is, I'm sure it is. He nodded, not dismissively, but not with real weight either. I never quite picture what the hierarchy looks like in that industry. Like, who are you reporting to? At the moment, I said carefully, the structure is that I'm at the VP level, reporting to the executive vice president. Okay. He seemed satisfied with this as a piece of information, in the way you're satisfied when something has been placed into the category where it belongs. That's good. That's good, Claire. Patricia reached for the bread without making eye contact. I looked at my plate. James, across from me, was very still. I want to tell you what was happening in my body in that moment, because I think it's important for understanding why I didn't say more. It wasn't that I had nothing to say. I had, if I had chosen to deploy it, a substantial and specific set of facts that would have reoriented the entire conversation in 30 seconds. I knew what I was paid. I knew what I had built. I knew the metrics and the outcomes and the recognition and the industry standing that my work had accumulated over 9 years, and none of it was small by any reasonable measure. But there is a particular exhaustion that comes from having to defend the value of your own life to someone who will not be changed by your defense. I had tried it in smaller versions for years. I had offered context and been met with polite incomprehension. I had offered specifics and been met with, "That's nice." The catalog of attempts was long enough that I had stopped keeping track of it, which is itself a form of information. So I looked at my plate and said nothing, and ate my food, and the conversation moved on to Patricia and the violin, and I sat with the specific weight of it and let the meal continue. Derek continued, in the reflective way that meant he was thinking out loud rather than performing. I just always thought you've always been analytical. I thought you'd end up somewhere more, he searched for the word, more strategic, like consulting or finance, something where the decisions are at the top. The decisions in operations are at the top, I said. That's what VP means. Sure. But within operations, the decisions are already... He paused, recognizing something in the sentence he'd started. He didn't finish it. Instead, it's great. Really. If it makes you happy, that's what matters. He picked up his fork. My mother said, "Patricia, how's Ellie doing with the violin?" The conversation moved. I ate my food and said nothing. Across the table, Richard was very still, and he had been watching, and he set down his fork with a quietness that I registered without fully understanding yet. My father carried the pie from the counter and set it on the table with the ceremony he reserved for things that required no comment, just action and presence. My mother cut it with the same care she brought to every portion at every meal I had ever eaten in that house. And for a few minutes, the table was softer. Derek talked to Ellie, who had come back downstairs and was now negotiating a piece of pie with a seriousness she brought only to dessert. Max appeared briefly, accepted pie, vanished. My father talked to James about the highway traffic coming up from the city, and I heard James be his particular kind of social, warm, specific, genuinely curious in a way that made people feel interesting. Maya sat next to me and ate her pie and did not look at me, which was the right call. Richard had his pie and coffee and said I counted afterward 11 words in that stretch of conversation, all of them unremarkable. Then Derek said, "You know, I was having lunch with a client last month. Big distribution outfit, one of our biggest ones. And he was talking about what people in his industry make at the senior level. He named a number. I knew the number. I recognized it the way you recognize a street you've driven down. It was lower than my base compensation by a margin that would have been uncomfortable to say out loud. I said nothing. Real money, Derek said. I didn't realize logistics had gotten that competitive, actually. Good to know. He looked at me with something that was genuinely warm. You probably know more about the numbers than I do. I do, I said. He nodded, pleased. He spooned the last of his pie. You know what I've always thought, he said, and here was the voice, the specific voice, the one that meant he was about to say the thing he'd been circling, is that you chose a manageable life instead of a hard one. And I don't mean that as a criticism. He said this with the certainty of someone who has never had to question whether their framing was valid. Some people want that. Predictability. Steady progress. I think that's smart. I think, Derek, my mother said. I'm paying her a compliment, he said, and he might have believed it. That is not something I can resolve. I'm saying she made a practical choice, and it's worked for her. Not everyone needs to be grinding at 60 hours a week. He looked at me. I just always wonder if you look at what you could have done and I'm doing what I chose to do, I said. My voice was level. And I chose it because it's what I'm good at and because the work is real. I know it's real, he said. Sincerely. I know it's real, Claire. I'm just saying there's real, and then there's, he paused again, and this was the pause where he almost stopped himself, and I watched him make the calculation and continue. There's real that changes things at scale. And logistics, I don't know. You're part of someone else's system. You're not the one driving the decisions that I drive the decisions, I said. That's what the title means. There was a silence. Maya looked up from her plate. She looked at me. She said, very quietly, Claire led a restructuring 2 years ago that saved Harrison Group $7.8 million in operational overhead. It was written up as a case study. Derek turned to her with a smile that was polite and not interested. That's great, he said. Really? Maya looked at me again. I shook my head, just slightly, just enough. Not yet. She picked up her fork. Something in Derek's face shifted then, not dramatically, just a flicker of something he was about to say. But before he could, Richard set down his fork. He set it down carefully, with the particular deliberateness of a man who has been listening for a long time and has decided that the listening is finished. He placed it on the edge of his plate. He reached for his coffee cup, changed his mind, set it back down. And then he looked at Derek with an expression I had seen in exactly one other context, the one he used when someone in a meeting was presenting an analysis that was confidently and significantly wrong. "I'm sorry," he said. I realize I should have introduced myself properly when we arrived. His voice was even, not cold, not warm, entirely direct, the way he was in every significant conversation I had ever been in with him. "My name is Richard Chen. I'm at Harrison Group, same company as Claire." Derek nodded. "Right. The VP." "I am a VP," Richard said. "And so is Claire." He paused for one beat. "We're the same level. We report to the same executive. We've been peers since March." Another pause. "I assumed you knew." The silence that followed was the kind that has texture. My father set down his fork slowly. My mother said, "Oh." Not, "Oh, how wonderful," and not, "Oh, we knew." Just, "Oh," the single syllable of a person receiving information that arrived in the wrong order. Derek was very still. He was looking at Richard, and then he was looking at me, and the expression on his face was one I had never seen there before. I have thought about it many times since, and I still don't have a clean name for it. It wasn't embarrassment, not in the surface sense. It was something underneath that, the expression of someone whose map has just been shown to be wrong, not in a minor detail, but in the central feature, the thing they had organized everything else around. "She's the youngest person we've ever promoted to the VP level in the company," Richard continued. He said it without emphasis, just as information, the way he stated any fact in any meeting, cleanly, without performance, expecting it to be received as data rather than drama. "I wanted to come meet her family because I find that most people's families have no idea what they've actually built. And I thought this would be a good opportunity." He picked up his coffee. I realize now that might have been an understatement. No one spoke for what felt like a long time. James, who had been watching all of this with the focused stillness of someone who has been prepared for something for 4 years and is watching it arrive, quietly moved his pie plate to the side. My mother said carefully, "8 months ago?" "March," I said. "You didn't mention." "I mentioned it," I said. "You asked if it would mean more hours." She looked at her plate. "I stopped mentioning things," I said. And I kept my voice the way I keep it in difficult operations meetings, level, factual, precise. Not punishing, just clear. "Not recently. It's been a while. After the press release, you said it was a nice photo. After the award, you sent a text the morning of, and I stood at the podium, and the family section was empty. After the restructuring that Maya mentioned, I tried to explain it, and you said it sounded complicated. I looked at my mother, then at my father. I know none of it was unkind. I know that. I'm not saying it was unkind. I'm saying that at some point I understood that the responses weren't going to be proportionate to the news, and I stopped sending the news." My father said, quietly, "I didn't know about any of that." "I know," I said. "The award?" "It's all right," I said, and I meant that. I don't need you to misunderstand this part. I was not performing forgiveness. I was stating something true. By the time I was sitting at that table, I was not looking for an apology. I was looking for an ending to a particular form of invisibility, and the ending had already happened, quietly, a few minutes before. Derek said, "I didn't." He stopped. He cleared his throat. He said, more carefully, "I didn't know it was at that level. The I didn't know. He looked at his wife. Patricia was looking at her hands. He looked back at me. I was condescending. Yes, I said. I didn't intend. I know you didn't, I said. And this is the part I need you to hear, because it is the most complicated and the most true. I believed him. Derek had never intended to diminish me. He had diminished me as a byproduct of never having seen me clearly, which is a different thing, and in some ways a harder one, because it doesn't have the clean resolution that intent does. You can't simply correct an intention. The seeing clearly has to happen on its own, or not at all. I'm sorry, he said. Quietly. Just to me. I know, I said. And then because I was genuinely tired and genuinely present, and because the table needed to breathe. Ellie had come back to the table at some point during all of this. I hadn't noticed exactly when, and was now sitting very still and eating her pie with the careful attention of a child who understands that something significant is happening, but is not certain what. She looked at Richard once, and he caught her eye and gave her the smallest of nods, and she looked back at her plate. My father said, to no one in particular, we should have come to that conference. I looked at him. He was looking at his coffee cup. Yes, I said. You should have. He nodded. Patricia, I noticed, said nothing throughout any of this. She reached across once and put her hand on Derek's arm. Not to comfort him, I thought, but to anchor him. It was such a small gesture. I wondered briefly what she had seen over 11 years, that she had filed away in the same quiet place where I filed things. Some truths don't get spoken at the table. They get carried home. Richard drank his coffee. He did not pile on. He had said what he'd said, and he let it work or not work entirely on its own terms. I had seen him operate this way in meetings. State the fact, wait, don't repeat. People either received it or they didn't, and repeating it never helped. My mother, after a moment, said, "More pie?" It was such a fundamentally my mother thing to say. I almost laughed, not unkindly. She was, in her own way, offering the only thing she knew how to offer in the space after a difficult truth, the practical comfort of something that could be portioned and distributed. Yes, Jane said, and held out his plate. We left at 4:30. My mother hugged me at the door for longer than she had in years. I felt her hands on my back, and I thought about the cream-colored card forwarded to my old address, and I said nothing about it, because the day had already carried enough. Derek walked us to the cars. He shook James's hand, then Maya's, then Richard's. Thank you for coming. And Richard said, your family is very kind, which was generous in the specific way of someone who has decided that generosity costs him nothing, and honesty has already done its work. When Derek got to me, he stood for a moment with his hands in his pockets. The cold had settled in during the afternoon, the kind that gets into the joints. He looked like he was choosing his words carefully, which was unusual for him. I'm sorry, Claire, he said. It's okay, I said. Both true and not true. The way these things usually are. I got in the car. Richard sat in the passenger seat. James and Maya were quiet in the back. For about 20 minutes, no one said anything. The highway was nearly empty, most people already where they were going, and the sky was the particular dark blue of a clear November late afternoon, the kind that looks like the beginning of winter, even when it isn't quite yet. Then Richard said, that was more than a holiday dinner. Yes. Do you want to talk about it? Not tonight, I said. Okay, he said, and he was quiet for the rest of the drive, and I was grateful for that in a way I can still feel clearly when I think about it. James, from the back seat, said nothing the entire drive. This was also the right call. He had been present for all of it, had watched with the precise attention of someone who understood the architecture of what had just happened, and had said almost nothing. A few words here, a redirected question there, and he had done it well enough that I doubted Derek had registered his presence as anything other than background. That kind of self-effacement, when you have the intelligence and the standing to make yourself visible, is a particular form of gift. I thought about saying so and didn't. Some things go without saying between people who have worked closely enough. Maya, on the other hand, sent me a text from the back seat at some point in the last 20 minutes of the drive. It said, "For what it's worth, I'm glad I was there." I looked at it and didn't respond. I put the phone in my jacket pocket and drove the rest of the way with both hands on the wheel. I dropped Richard at his hotel first. He got out and then turned back at the door and said, "Thank you for inviting me. I mean that." He meant something specific by it that I didn't try to unpack in the moment. I said, "Thank you for coming," and drove away. James and Maya I dropped at their neighborhood in that order, 15 minutes apart. James said good night at the door of his building and held my gaze for an extra second, which was enough. Maya gave me a quick hug and said, "Call me if you need to talk, anytime," and I believed her. I drove home, parked in my building's garage, sat in the car for a while, not processing anything particularly, not crying, not in the elevated state of someone who has just had a significant experience, just sitting. The kind of sitting that happens when you've been in a room for a long time with something heavy and you're waiting for your body to understand that you've left. My mother called the following Monday at 11:30, which was her calling time when she wanted a real conversation, after my father's morning news, before the afternoon errands. "I looked up the press release," she said. I set down my coffee. "Okay," I said. "The one from 2 years ago. About the restructuring." A pause. "It named you. It said you led the project." "I did lead it." "And the trade publication article. I found that too. There were several of them, actually, about different things." "Yes," I said. "There were." She was quiet for a moment. I heard her sit down, the kitchen chair, the one that has creaked the same way since I was 9. "I think," she said slowly, "that I didn't ask good questions." "No," I said. I let myself say it plainly, without softening. "You didn't." "I think," she stopped. Tried again. "Derek always told us everything. Every case, every detail, every win. And you didn't tell us things. And I think I let not being told become not asking." She paused. "That wasn't right." "No," I said again. "It wasn't." "I'm sorry, Claire." She said it the way she said things she meant, simply without decoration. "I know you are," I said. "I believe you." She asked if we could have dinner, just the two of us, in January. She said it in the way of someone proposing something real rather than something polite, a little careful, a little formal, the way you ask for something you're not sure you deserve. I said yes. Derek did not call. He texted 5 days after Thanksgiving. The message read, "I've been thinking about Thursday. I owe you more than a text, but wanted to say something first. I'm sorry. I should have asked more questions a long time ago. And then, a few minutes later, a second text. I'm proud of you. I should have said that a long time ago. I read both messages twice. Then I put my phone down and went back to the quarterly review I was working on, and I sat with the feeling of those words for a while before I could tell what was in them. What was in them, mostly, was true. That was the thing I eventually landed on. It was true that he should have asked. It was true that he was proud of me, or that he was becoming proud of me, or that he was realizing there was something to be proud of. The distinctions were blurry in a way I decided not to spend too long examining. I wrote back, I know. Let's talk soon. I didn't call for a few weeks. Not as punishment. I want to be precise about that. I just needed some time to be in my own life without the question of whether someone in my family understood it. The work continued. The days had their own weight and their own satisfactions. I needed to be in those things for a while. At my one-on-one with Richard the Tuesday after Thanksgiving, he asked how I was doing. I said fine. He nodded, and we went through the agenda. At the end, as he was closing his notebook, he said, "The work you've built is real. Any room you walk into, it's real." Thank you, I said. I meant it in a way that was not about the dinner. James brought me coffee that Friday without explanation. Set it on my desk, gone before I looked up. Maya sent me an article from an operations journal she'd annotated in the margins with observations that were, by turns, sharp, funny, and more incisive than the article itself. I laughed out loud at my desk for the first time in what felt like months. I filed the annotated article in the same drawer where I keep the press release clipping. The drawer also holds the conference photo, a handwritten note from the executive VP after the Q3 results came in, and a napkin from the lunch where I found out about the promotion. I have no idea why I kept the napkin, only that in that moment I needed to hold something concrete. The drawer is not organized. I have never needed it to be. My mother and I had dinner in January at a restaurant she'd chosen, cloth napkins, a waiter who read the specials, and she had dressed up, and so had I, without either of us mentioning it. For the first time in longer than I could clearly locate, I told her the real shape of my work. Not the highlights reel, not the press release version, the actual texture of it, the days when nothing moved correctly, and the meetings that felt pointless, and the particular satisfaction of a restructured system running cleanly after weeks of resistance. The way decisions at my level weren't clean choices between right and wrong options, but imperfect choices between competing constraints, made under time pressure, with incomplete information, with people's jobs sometimes in the balance. The way I still, after 9 years, felt something when a solution worked. Not triumph, exactly, but a quieter thing, the satisfaction of having found the true shape of a problem. She listened. She asked questions. Not always the right questions. She was 67, and the vocabulary of operations was not her native language. But she asked, and she listened to the answers. And when the bill came, she paid before I could reach for my card, which was not something she had done in years. On the drive home, I thought about the tablecloth with the small brown leaves, the card forwarded to the old address, the pie that had been good. I called Derek the week after the dinner with my mother. We talked for almost an hour. He asked real questions, not about the hierarchy or where I fell on the org chart, but about what the work actually felt like, what I was solving, what I found hard. I told him about the New Jersey compliance issue, about the 6 underperforming contracts, about the 3 facilities, and what the inefficiency had looked like from the inside. He listened in a way I had not experienced from him before, without interjecting, without redirecting toward himself, without offering the comparative frame of his own work. At one point, he said, "I had no idea you were managing that kind of scale." And I said, "I know." And we were quiet for a moment. And that was the most honest exchange we'd had in 15 years. By the end of the call, we had made plans to get dinner in the spring. We haven't made them firm yet, but we made them. I don't know if the picture has fully changed. Some patterns run very deep, and the depth isn't undone by one November afternoon and a few conversations in the weeks after. But something has moved. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way that things shift when the true thing is finally in the room, and everyone can see it, and no one is pretending otherwise. My mother sent a Christmas card to my current address. I put it on my desk at work, between the desk lamp and the photo from the national conference that I'd attended 3 years ago and come home from alone. I said nothing about it to anyone. I didn't need to.